The sun, a fiery orb, beat down on the ancient stones of a city that had for 2 millennia borne names that resonated with history's grandest narratives. Once Byzantium, then Constantinople, it stood as the undisputed heir to the Roman Empire, a beacon of civilization that had proudly held the torch of Roman legacy for an astonishing 1,123 years. This unbroken line of imperial succession, a testament to its enduring power and influence, was a record unparalleled even by the storied monarchies of Britain. Yet, even the longest chains can be shattered. On a fateful day, May 29, 1453, the seemingly impregnable walls of this magnificent metropolis were breached. The architect of its downfall was Mehmed II, the audacious Turkish sultan, forever to be known as the Conqueror. With a thunderous roar, his forces surged through the defenses, and the ancient symbol of the cross, which had adorned its battlements for centuries, yielded to the crescent. In the heart of the ravaged city, a new era dawned as Islam, a vibrant and dynamic religion, was triumphantly proclaimed. Though its name would evolve to Istanbul, for its Greek inhabitants, the empire's loyal subjects, it remained simply Ipolis, the city, an acknowledgement of its singular and unparalleled status in the world. Their affectionate term, Stimpoli, eventually echoed by their Turkish conquerors, birthed the name by which it is known today, Istanbul. The very genesis of this extraordinary city can be traced back to the vision of a Roman emperor, Constantine the Great. Spear in hand, he personally delineated the contours of its future walls, famously declaring, when questioned about his relentless march, "When he stops, who now leads me on?" Whether legend or truth, one fact remains undeniable. His choice of location was nothing short of brilliant. Perched on a diminutive, triangular promontory that extended like a beckoning finger towards Asia, it represented Europe's farthest embrace, a thwarted kiss between 2 mighty continents. Its strategic position was unparalleled, straddling the vital trade arteries that linked the north with the south and the east with the west. To its south lay the serene, almost landlocked, Sea of Marmara, its waters glistening under the Mediterranean sun. To the east, the mouth of the Bosphorus beckoned, a shimmering gateway to the vast expanse of the Black Sea. And to the north, a natural marvel, the Golden Horn, a long, curved inlet, offered a harbor unlike any other on Earth, providing unparalleled protection and accessibility for its burgeoning maritime trade. On May 11, 330 AD, the emperor himself presided over the city's dedication, christening it Constantinople, the New Rome. The heart of public life pulsed at its eastern extremity, where a monumental complex comprising the imperial palace, the grand hippodrome, and the awe-inspiring church of St. Sophia, the Holy Wisdom, converged in a breathtaking display of imperial power and spiritual devotion. From this nexus, the city's main thoroughfare, a majestic artery, swept westward. It was a path flanked by rows of stoic marble lions, leading past 3 bustling forums and the venerable Church of the Holy Apostles, culminating at the city's most crucial defensive feature, the formidable land walls. These walls, an engineering marvel of their time, stretched from the uppermost reaches of the Golden Horn, winding their way southward until they met the tranquil waters of the Marmara, near the revered monastery of St. John of Studium. Today, only scattered fragments of the Studium remain, a poignant whisper of its former glory. It seems almost inconceivable that this desolate ruin was once the preeminent monastery of the Byzantine Empire, the very cradle from which the rich monastic tradition of the Orthodox Church blossomed. Yet, its significance extended far beyond its spiritual role. To truly grasp its importance, one must consider the state of Western Europe during this tumultuous period. The Roman Empire of the West, a shadow of its former self, had finally capitulated towards the close of the 5th century, its demise hastened by the relentless incursions of Goths, Huns, and Vandals. While chaos reigned in the West, here, at the very outermost fringe of Europe, the cherished legacy of classical antiquity was meticulously preserved. Much of our understanding of ancient knowledge, including the intricate edifice of Roman law, is directly attributable to the diligent scholars, scribes, and copyists of Constantinople, with the Studium monastery serving as a pivotal center of intellectual activity. What set Constantinople apart was its progressive attitude towards learning. Unlike the West, where intellectual pursuits were often confined to the cloistered world of priests and monks, in Byzantium, intellectualism was embraced and celebrated by all strata of society. No one here harbored shame for their scholarly inclinations. It was this vibrant intellectual climate that led to the Byzantines' profound dismay when the Crusaders finally arrived. They viewed these great hulking louts, as they perceived them, who arrogantly styled themselves noblemen, yet possessed a singular focus on hunting and fighting, barely able to inscribe their own names, with a mixture of contempt and pity. These Western warriors, of course, hailed from lands where the illuminating flame of learning had been all but extinguished, save for a few sporadic, flickering monastic embers. In stark contrast, within the hallowed confines of Byzantium, that flame blazed with an unyielding intensity. The exquisite beauty of Byzantine art was a symphony of delicate colors, an exuberant profusion of design, and an unbridled lavishness of materials. The women of Byzantium, like living jewels, were adorned with breathtaking ornaments, gold, sapphires, and pearls cascading in dazzling displays. In the nascent centuries of the empire, artists frequently drew inspiration from the rich tapestry of ancient mythology, breathing new life into timeless tales. Here, Pegasus, the winged steed, soared with vibrant energy, and Europa, captivated by the bull, embodied a profound sense of movement, life, and raw power. Upon this ancient Greek foundation, the Romans had meticulously grafted their own formidable gifts: an unparalleled talent for administration, a sophisticated legal system that would influence civilizations for millennia, and an engineering prowess that defied the imagination. The monumental aqueduct of Valens, constructed by the 4th century emperor of the same name, stood as a testament to their genius, ensuring an unfailing water supply to the burgeoning metropolis. This vital resource was meticulously stored in colossal cisterns, such as the subterranean marvel built by Justinian in the early 6th century, its vast expanse supported by an astonishing 336 columns, a veritable underground forest of stone. Constantine's final, profound gift to his new capital was the embrace of Christianity, and this, perhaps more than anything, was the wellspring of Byzantium's ethereal splendor. The city, now possessing not only a Greek mind and a Roman body, but also an Oriental mystical Christian soul, had in some miraculous way unlocked the secret of visually articulating that soul, a feat unmatched by any other civilization. Byzantine art, though often hieratic and stylized, possessed an undeniable power to stir the human spirit, a visual language that transcended the material and spoke directly to the soul. The little church, now known as Kyriai Kamiai Kora Church, stood as one of the last architectural gems to be erected before the city's eventual fall. Even amidst Byzantium's encroaching decline, its creative genius remained remarkably fertile, and within the hallowed walls of Kyriai, that genius burst forth in a spectacular efflorescence of artistic expression. Yet, all the churches of Constantinople, no matter how magnificent, were ultimately overshadowed by the colossal grandeur of St. Sophia itself, crowned by a dome that seemed to defy the very laws of gravity, a miraculous architectural feat suspended effortlessly above the sacred space. For 14 centuries, that dome, pierced by 40 windows that allowed torrents of light to stream inward, had hung there, a celestial canopy beneath which all was pure light and boundless space. When Emperor Justinian, in a moment of profound awe and humility, dedicated the church in 537 AD, he could only whisper, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." 9 centuries later, it was within these very walls that the emperor and his people would gather for their final, heart-wrenching assembly. The most devastating blow ever inflicted upon the city, the one that, more than any other, precipitated its ultimate downfall, was dealt not by the advancing Turks, but by the very forces of Western Europe. In a ludicrous twist of fate, the Venetians, driven by avarice and geopolitical ambition, cunningly persuaded the army of the Fourth Crusade in 1203 to abandon their sacred pilgrimage to the Holy Land and instead divert their focus towards the glittering prize of Constantinople. Upon their arrival, they were initially received with a fragile warmth. By this time, the Byzantine emperors had established a new imperial residence, the Palace of Blacherny, nestled against the northern reaches of the formidable land walls. The Crusader forces encamped on the hillside overlooking the Golden Horn, a menacing presence on the city's periphery. They lingered for approximately 6 months, orchestrating a series of chaotic palace revolutions, sowing discord and instability within the city's already fragile political landscape. Then, on the solemn occasion of Good Friday in 1204, the unthinkable happened. They turned their entire armed might against their Greek hosts. They descended upon the city like a swarm of ravenous locusts, unleashing a torrent of destruction and plunder. Gibbon, the renowned historian, starkly records that the French share of the plunder alone, which was demonstrably less than that claimed by the rapacious Venetians, amounted to 7 times the entire annual income of the Kingdom of England. Nothing, it seemed, was sacred. Even the magnificent 4 bronze horses of Lysippos, which had graced Constantinople for nearly a millennium, were brutally torn from their pedestals and carted off to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice, a permanent trophy of their wanton destruction. So too were these exquisite gold plaques of enamel, perhaps the very objects that stirred the imagination of W.B. Yeats when he envisioned a Grecian goldsmith crafting forms from hammered gold and gold enameling, designed to rouse a drowsy emperor or to be set upon a golden branch, singing to Byzantine lords and ladies of the past, present, or future. Constantinople, a city once so vibrant and prosperous, never truly recovered from the cataclysmic impact of the Fourth Crusade, nor from the 60 years that followed, a period of shame and humiliation during which Frankish criminals brazenly usurped the imperial throne. When at long last, the Greeks managed to reclaim their beloved city, they found it a mere shadow of its former self, impoverished, depopulated, and utterly devastated. Enemies now lurked along every frontier, constantly probing its weakened defenses. What remained of the crucial Levantine trade, once the lifeblood of the empire, had been irrevocably lost, now monopolized by the opportunistic Venetians and Genoese. The depth of the empire's destitution was starkly evident at the wedding feast of John VI in 1347. Not a single piece of gold or silver adorned the table, and acute observers noted with dismay that all the crown jewels were pitifully false. And with an inexorable, suffocating certainty, the Ottoman Turks were drawing ever closer. In 1326, they had seized Bursa, a humble hill town nestled in Bithynia, making it their Asiatic capital. Bursa was destined to become the venerated burial place of Othman, the first great leader from whom the dynasty took its very name, and of his early successors. Etched upon his tomb were the resonant words, "Sultan, son of the Sultan of the Ghazis, Margrave of the Horizons, hero of the world." Yet, Othman's conquests were but a prelude. 40 years later, his grandson, Murad I, tightened the suffocating noose, establishing himself at Adrianople, a far more menacing vantage point, a dagger poised at the heart of the Byzantine remnant. On February 13, 1451, a young man ascended the Ottoman throne. His name was Mehmed II, but in a mere 2.5 years, he would be universally hailed by his people as Fatih, the conqueror. Though a youth at the time of his accession, this portrait, now housed in the National Gallery, was painted later in his life by the renowned Gentile Bellini. Mehmed, it seems, held a particular fondness for this depiction, rewarding the painter handsomely with 3,000 ducats and a prestigious chain and collar of gold. He was a man of profound intellect, fluent in 6 languages, including impeccable Latin and Greek, a testament to his intellectual curiosity. Yet, he was also an enigma, secretive, introverted, and possessed of a chilling streak of cruelty. Above all, he was consumed by an insatiable ambition, and for Mehmed, that ambition revolved around one singular objective, Constantinople. Once firmly ensconced on the throne, he wasted no time. Less than a year after his accession, he had amassed a vast workforce, over 1,000 skilled masons and countless laborers, to construct a formidable and menacing castle on the European side of the Bosphorus, precisely where the straits were at their narrowest. Gibbon, with his unparalleled descriptive prowess, paints a vivid picture of the scene. Mehmed insisted and directed the work with unwavering determination. His 3 viziers claimed the honor of finishing their respective towers. The Sultan's service to God elevated even the most meager labor, and a despot whose smile represented the promise of fortune and his frown the sign of death accelerated the diligence of the masses. As a result of this relentless drive, the entire colossal castle was completed in just under 4 months. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, immediately dispatched messengers to the Sultan, ostensibly to inquire about his intentions. Yet deep down, he must have known them with a chilling certainty. Mehmed's response was brutally simple. He seized all the ambassadors and executed them without mercy, a clear and terrifying declaration of his hostile intent. The Greeks, tragically, were already grappling with their own debilitating internal strife. The emperor's brother and predecessor on the throne, John VIII, had dedicated his entire reign to the Sisyphean task of securing support from the Western powers to salvage his crumbling empire. To this end, he had even made the agonizing concession of recognizing the supremacy of the Pope, a desperate measure given that the Eastern and Western churches had been locked in a bitter schism for 4 centuries. Yet all his efforts proved futile. Europe had failed to respond. John's people, for their part, had never forgiven him for his perceived betrayal of Orthodox tradition, and his brother Constantine inherited a city racked by division, its spirit demoralized. We know frustratingly little about this last and most tragic of all the Byzantine emperors. He was approximately 44 years old, tall and somewhat stout, perhaps a little lacking in imagination, but undeniably straightforward and utterly sincere. He was a competent administrator, but most importantly, a soldier of uncommon bravery. He would need every ounce of that bravery now, for any man sitting on the Byzantine throne at this juncture would have his courage tested to its absolute limits. The empire had shrunk to an almost unimaginable degree, its dominion barely extending beyond the immediate confines of the city itself. Furthermore, the city had been reduced to little more than a collection of disparate villages within its walls, a consequence of 9 devastating incursions of the Black Death in less than a century. Compounding this physical decline was the spiritual and intellectual malaise wrought by relentless religious debate, which had left its inhabitants deeply demoralized. A swift census of all those capable of bearing arms, including even the monks, yielded a heartbreakingly meager total of 4,983 Greeks, augmented by a mere 2,000-odd foreigners, predominantly Italians. In the face of such overwhelming odds, only one slender hope remained: the formidable land walls. These defensive barriers were constructed in 3 formidable layers. First, a deep ditch, guarded by a low outer rampart, presented the initial obstacle. The second line of defense was a wide, flat strip of land that followed, serving as a vital space for patrols and inspections. Then, and only then, came the great land walls themselves, an engineering marvel that had stood unbreached for 1,006 years since their construction by Emperor Theodosius II. On Easter Monday, 1453, the ominous advance guard of the Sultan's army was sighted by the Byzantine lookouts. Immediately, the emperor issued a series of decisive orders. All gates were to be closed, the bridges across the ditch were to be destroyed, and most crucially, the great chain was to be flung across the mouth of the Golden Horn, effectively blocking it to the Turkish warships. These were wise and desperate moves. Within 3 days, a staggering 150,000-strong Turkish army was arrayed along the entire length of the land walls. In the very center, the Sultan's tent, a symbol of his imperial might, stood surrounded by his elite corps of janissaries. The defenders, though vastly outnumbered, were prepared for the onslaught. In addition to the courageous Greeks, their ranks included all the men of the Venetian colony, along with approximately 700 Genoese soldiers, commanded by the renowned soldier Giustiniani. He, appalled and disgusted by his own government's apathy, had taken matters into his own hands, arriving to offer his formidable expertise. Greeks, Genoese, and Venetians, united in their desperate struggle, stood at their allotted stations, ready to face the inevitable assault. The Byzantines also fully comprehended the nature of the challenge they faced. Mehmed prided himself on his artillery, a comparatively new and devastating weapon which he intended to deploy on an unprecedented scale. One of these colossal cannons, a testament to Ottoman ingenuity, is now housed in the Tower of London. However, he had also commissioned an even larger, more monstrous weapon from a rebel Hungarian engineer. This behemoth was 27 feet long and required 50 pairs of oxen to pull its immense weight. It was capable of hurling half-ton cannonballs for a mile or more, a truly terrifying instrument of war. In these initial days of the siege, the Sultan concentrated the overwhelming power of his artillery on the central section of the walls, precisely where they sloped down to a small stream, rendering them particularly vulnerable from the higher ground on either side. He inflicted significant damage to the outer defenses, but thanks to the heroic efforts of Giustiniani and his stalwart Genoese, the massive inner rampart held firm, a defiant bastion against the relentless bombardment. Simultaneously, a prolonged and desperate conflict had erupted at sea. The Ottoman navy lay at anchor about a mile away from the entrance to the Golden Horn, at the mouth of the Bosphorus. A contemporary French manuscript vividly depicts their struggle. Their initial attempts to force the harbor boom were largely ineffective, met with fierce resistance. Greek fire, that legendary flaming secret weapon, continued to wreak havoc on their adversaries, and a relentless hail of arrows from the defending ships proved devastatingly effective. Then, on April 20th, the Turkish lookouts spotted 3 Genoese galleys and an imperial transport ship, heavily laden with precious corn, attempting to break through the blockade. A fierce and brief battle ensued, observed by Mehmed himself from the shore, who, in his excitement, kept spurring his forces into the sea until his clothes were trailing in the water. As evening descended, the 4 Christian vessels, battered but miraculously still afloat, managed to smash their way through the enemy lines, slipping safely into the protective embrace of the harbor. The Sultan, enraged by this setback, personally subjected his admiral to a humiliating public bastinado and disgrace, then turned his full, terrifying attention to the Golden Horn. He had to find a way to breach its defenses. And then suddenly, his masterstroke came to him. If he couldn't burst the boom head-on, he would simply circumvent it, rounding the northern walls of Pera, a brilliant and audacious plan. He immediately enlisted a vast workforce to construct a massive causeway up the valley that stretched from the Bosphorus mouth, over the imposing Pera hill, and down the other side. And so, on Sunday, April 22nd, Constantinople bore witness to perhaps the most extraordinary scene in all its long and storied history, as one after another, some 70 ships were laboriously dragged on wheeled cradles over a 200-foot bridge, then slowly and meticulously lowered down the other side into the tranquil waters of the Golden Horn. The Greeks' initial amazement at this incredible feat must have quickly morphed into a profound and crushing despair. No longer could they rely on a safe and unassailable anchorage for their fleet. Now, too, they had an additional 3 miles of vulnerable seawall to defend, their already stretched resources further strained. Another agonizing month crawled by, and then the last shattering blow fell upon the dwindling Christian hopes. A swift Venetian brigantine, dispatched 3 weeks prior to search for an expected relief fleet from Venice, returned at the probable cost of their own lives, bearing the devastating news. No trace of the fleet had been found. The emperor, tears streaming down his face, thanked them, whispering, "Only Christ could save the city now." But to many, it seemed that even Christ had abandoned them. On May 24th, the full moon, a symbol of hope and solace, went into a total eclipse, casting an ominous shadow over the beleaguered city. The city's holiest icon, being carried in a solemn procession through the streets, suddenly slipped from its platform and crashed to the ground, a chilling omen. No sooner had it been righted than a furious hailstorm erupted over the capital, a storm of such unprecedented ferocity that the entire procession had to be abandoned in disarray. The following morning, men awoke to find Constantinople shrouded in a dense, unnatural fog, an unheard-of phenomenon for the end of May, further deepening the pervasive sense of dread. In his palace, his desperate ministers implored Constantine to escape, to rally resistance abroad, but he steadfastly refused, his resolve unwavering. His place, he declared, was with his people, come what may. On May 28th, he summoned his court, his closest friends, and his family, and in a poignant display of humility, asked for their forgiveness for any offenses he might have committed in the past. He then joined the swelling crowds that were converging on all of the capital's churches as evening approached. The contentious service of reconciliation with Rome, which had been held in St. Sophia, had caused many Orthodox Christians to avoid the great church ever since, viewing it as tainted. But now, at this hour of the city's ultimate trial, doctrinal differences were forgotten, swept away by the overwhelming tide of shared peril. That evening, with Orthodox and Roman priests standing side by side, united in their faith, the Christian liturgy was celebrated in St. Sophia for the very last time, a solemn and heartbreaking farewell. When the service concluded, the emperor, with a heavy heart, rode down the entire length of the walls, meticulously ensuring that every possible preparation had been made, that every man was at his assigned post, his gaze sweeping over the grim faces of his defenders. Then, around midnight, he returned to his palace and climbed to the summit of this tower, from whence he gazed down at the myriad Turkish watchtowers, their fires flickering ominously in the darkness. His gaze swept south along the walls to the river valley and beyond, then north down the slopes to the Golden Horn, taking in the full, terrifying panorama of his city's imminent fate. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, the Sultan gave the order for his most massive and devastating attack. The sudden noise, erupting from the deathly stillness of the night, was ear-splitting. The cacophony of clashing weapons, the thunderous roar of the cannon, and the wild, guttural battle cries of the Turkish irregulars, wielding their crude bazookas, as they surged forward into the assault from above. Within moments, these terrifying sounds were answered by the desperate pealing of all the bells of Constantinople's churches, their frantic tolling rallying every able-bodied defender to the walls, a desperate plea for resistance. After another agonizing 3 hours, a shattering shot from the great cannon brought down an entire section of an improvised stockade, a vital part of the crumbling defenses. The river valley, where the ramparts had been mercilessly battered for 7 long weeks, was once more the focal point of the bulk of the offensive, a gaping wound in the city's side. 300 fearless Turks from the Anatolian regiments rushed forward, but the Greeks, led by their emperor in person, closed with them in a desperate, hand-to-hand struggle, and against all odds, somehow managed to drive them back into the ditch. Dawn broke, painting the sky with the colors of a new day. But for the defenders, outnumbered by a crushing 20-1, exhaustion was now their most formidable enemy. The Janissaries, Mehmed's ultimate trump card, now entered the fray. These elite warriors, rigorously chosen and meticulously trained to superb standards of physical fitness and unwavering strength, were a terrifying force. Then, a new and utterly devastating blow fell. Giustiniani, the heroic Genoese commander, was grievously wounded and had to be removed from the walls. When his men witnessed their fearless leader being carried away, a wave of panic swept through their ranks, and they fled in disarray, abandoning their posts. The Greeks were left to face the overwhelming enemy entirely on their own. Almost simultaneously, an even more terrible disaster unfolded. At the northern end of the walls, hard by where they met the imperial palace, there had stood a small postern gate, a seemingly innocuous opening through which the defenders had occasionally launched desperate sallies against the enemy flank. By some terrible mischance, the last ones to use it had left it unbarred, a fatal oversight. The vigilant Turks, seizing upon this incredible opportunity, fell upon it with ruthless efficiency, bursting their way through the unguarded opening. Turkish standards, symbols of their triumphant conquest, were immediately raised on the tower above, and the Sultan, his voice ringing with exultation, summoned his Janissaries for the final, decisive assault with a thunderous cry. "The city is ours!" The Greeks, now utterly alone, exhausted beyond measure, and completely overwhelmed, had no hope of holding them back. It was the end, the tragic, inevitable end of the Byzantine Empire. When the Emperor Constantine XI realized that all hope was irrevocably gone, he seized his sword and, with a final desperate act of defiance, ran down the walls to where the hand-to-hand fighting was thickest, plunging himself into the maelstrom of battle. He was never seen again in any recognizable form. Much later, amidst the gruesome aftermath, his body was identified, though it lacked a head. Yet the purple boots, intricately embroidered with the revered Byzantine imperial eagle, still covered his feet, a poignant reminder of his imperial lineage and his heroic last stand. The ensuing slaughter was horrific, as the victorious Turkish troops surged across the walls and through the streets, unleashing a torrent of violence and devastation even worse than what the Crusaders had inflicted 2 centuries earlier. However, though tradition permitted 3 days of unrestrained rapine and looting after the storming of a city, the Sultan, in a remarkable display of control, restricted his soldiers to just 1. In the midst of his greatest victory, Mehmed appears to have been strangely calm and collected, his demeanor betraying an almost eerie serenity. Not until late afternoon did he finally enter Constantinople. Slowly, deliberately, he rode to St. Sophia, where before the high altar, he touched his turban to the ground in a solemn act of prayer and thanksgiving. From that instant, the great church, after more than 9 centuries of uninterrupted Christian worship, was transformed irrevocably into a mosque. His prayers concluded, the conqueror rode across the vast square and through the ancient hippodrome, passing the silent reminder on the pedestal of an obelisk of how the emperors of long ago had watched the thunderous chariot races. And so, he rode on to the ruins of the oldest imperial palace of them all, where nothing remained but the dusty floor mosaics, their forgotten loveliness a fading echo of the glories that had vanished. In those distant days, Byzantium had been young, vibrant with promise. Then, it had ascended to greatness, its emperors walking with God and his archangels, much like the apostles of old. And now, as the conquering sultan passed through the lengthening shadows of ancient Byzantium, a Persian poet's murmured words seemed to hang in the air, a melancholic elegy for a fallen empire. The spider weaves the curtains in the palace of the Caesars. In Euphrasia's towers, the owl calls the guards. Mehmed too, the architect of this monumental change, was just 21 years old. Constantinople, now Istanbul, had fallen. In the west, the news of the city's demise was met with a chorus of horror and lamentation. And rightly so, for it was Western Europe, through the unforgivable treachery of the Fourth Crusade, that had inflicted the mortal wound upon Byzantium. The Turks had merely delivered the coup de grace, the final, fatal blow. Even at the very end, the feuding princes of the West might have delayed the inevitable, might have offered the lifeline that could have saved the city. But they did not. They argued and prevaricated, consumed by their own petty squabbles and short-sighted ambitions. Byzantium perished as Europe dithered, paralyzed by inaction. Yet, its life had been long, brilliant, and glorious. And when, after well over 1,000 years of continuous existence, it was finally conquered, it was only after having held out heroically for 53 days against overwhelming odds, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its defenders. Its last emperor, Constantine XI, had died as he would have wished to die, fighting valiantly for his beloved city, sword in hand. Neither he nor it ever surrendered. As Ottoman Istanbul slowly, majestically, emerged from the ashes of Byzantium, like a phoenix reborn, men began to realize that the Turks had not simply conquered. They had brought prosperity back to the city. They had transformed its beauty, infusing it with new life, new purpose, and a renewed dynamism. Thanks to their vision and stewardship, it remained for 5 more centuries an imperial capital, a grand seat of power that would shape the course of history. Though no longer a capital, Istanbul is still a thriving metropolis, a vibrant tapestry of ancient history and modern life. At the mouth of the Bosphorus, directly opposite the first anchorage of Mehmed's ships, an ornate palace, a testament to the grandeur of his successors, now stands. Across the very waters on which his admiral had suffered such humiliation, little ferries now ceaselessly shuttle countless commuters between the continents of Europe and Asia, a constant flow of life and commerce. The hill behind it, over which Mehmed so audaciously dragged his fleet, now roars and trembles with the relentless impact of 1,000 battered Chevrolets, a symphony of modern life superimposed upon ancient triumphs. And yet, the Turks have not forgotten him, nor his monumental victory. They still commemorate its anniversary with pride and solemnity on the 29th of May, a day that forever marks the glorious birth of a new era.